In the early 1900s, millions of people were crossing the Atlantic Ocean. For some, it was a search for a better life in America. For others, a grand luxury vacation. It was an era defined by a belief that technology was finally mastering the natural world. Shipping companies were locked in a fierce competition to dominate this booming transatlantic market. The White Star Line adopted a specific strategy to beat its rivals. Instead of focusing on raw speed, they would build ships of staggering size and supreme, unmatched luxury. The ultimate expression of that strategy was the RMS Titanic, weighing over 46,000 tons and stretching nearly 900 feet long. It was the largest moving object ever constructed at the time, a massive vessel that dwarfed every other ship on the sea. Inside, the massive ship resembled a floating palace. First-class passengers had access to elegant grand staircases, swimming pools, Turkish baths, and dining rooms that mirrored the finest land-based hotels in Europe. This focus on elegance transformed the North Atlantic from a hostile environment into a backdrop for a social event. When a ship feels like a palace, the inherent risks of the open ocean begin to feel like a secondary concern. This illustration shows the Titanic's core safety feature: 16 distinct, watertight compartments running along the hull's bottom. Designed to contain flooding, this led the public to a dangerous assumption. They believed this physical barrier made sinking a mathematical impossibility. While the ship grew to these massive proportions, the laws governing it remained fixed in an earlier era. The Titanic was effectively a 20th century giant operating under a 19th century playbook that had not been updated to account for ships of this scale. This chart shows the tangible result of that regulatory gap. The Titanic was carrying over 2,200 passengers and crew, yet it was permitted to sail with only 20 lifeboats, providing enough seats for barely half the people on board. The industry's confidence in a watertight hull had replaced the need for backup plans. Engineering hadn't just improved safety, it had convinced the operators that traditional, redundant safety nets were no longer necessary. On April 14th, as the voyage progressed, the ship's radio operators received multiple telegraph messages from nearby vessels. These incoming reports warned of massive ice fields drifting directly into their path, yet the Titanic maintained nearly full speed. The danger of their speed was compounded by a rare environmental condition. The sea that night was flat as glass. Without ocean waves breaking against the edges of hidden icebergs to create visible foam, the ice was practically invisible until it was directly in front of the bow. At 11:40 p.m., the lookouts in the crow's nest finally spotted a dark mass of ice ahead. They immediately rang the warning bell and telephoned the bridge, triggering a frantic order to reverse the engines and turn the wheel hard to the side. The habit of maintaining speed, combined with the deceptive silence of the glassy ocean, by the time the ice was spotted, the crew had already lost the window of time required to maneuver the 46,000-ton vessel out of danger.
This model shows how the evasion attempt actually sealed the ship's fate. By turning at the last moment, the crew avoided a head-on crash, but forced the starboard side of the hull to scrape forcefully along the jagged, underwater shelf of the iceberg. That long, glancing scrape overwhelmed the ship's safety design. The impact tore open 5 adjacent compartments below the waterline, allowing seawater to bypass the watertight bulkheads and flood the hull at a rate the pumps couldn't handle. When the ship's designer, Thomas Andrews, inspected the damage, the reality was clear. The vessel was designed to stay afloat with 4 compartments flooded, but not 5. The weight of the water would now inevitably pull the bow down. Up on deck, a strange delay took hold. Because the ship was brightly lit and felt stable, many passengers simply did not believe it was in danger. They refused to leave the warmth of the massive liner for tiny wooden boats in the freezing darkness. By the time the danger was undeniable, the loading process fell into chaos. Amid the confusion, the crew lowered many of the few available lifeboats with dozens of empty seats, leaving hundreds of people with no means of escape. Just after 2 a.m., the rising water pulled the bow deep beneath the surface, lifting the tail section high into the air. The stress of thousands of tons of unsupported steel finally caused the hull to fracture and violently break in two.
The sinking was a slow structural collapse. A specific impact at a specific speed overwhelmed a design that was never meant to sustain damage across nearly a third of its length. Over 1,500 people were left in the dark, near-freezing waters of the North Atlantic. In those temperatures, the cold alone limited survival to a matter of minutes. Amid the crisis, the ship's musicians gathered on the slanting deck and continued to play, attempting to keep the remaining passengers calm. Not one of the musicians survived the night. At 4 a.m., the rescue ship Carpathia arrived to pull 705 survivors from the lifeboats. When the news finally reached the mainland, the staggering loss of life and the destruction of a ship deemed practically unsinkable changed the public's relationship with technology. This shift led to the immediate creation of modern maritime safety laws. International regulations were rewritten to mandate that every ship carry enough lifeboats for 100% of the people on board. Authorities also required vessels to maintain 24-hour radio watches so that distress calls would never be ignored. They established the International Ice Patrol to monitor and broadcast hazards, a system that is still in use today. The wreck remained hidden until 1985, when it was discovered resting 12,500 feet below the surface. It stands as a quiet, haunting monument to the specific sequence of choices that ultimately led to the disaster. The Titanic remains the reason that modern maritime safety is built on the assumption that even the most advanced machines can fail. It serves as a permanent reminder that the strength of any engineering project is only as good as the safety nets we build.